Hello, this is just a short conversation between me and Andrew about some issues on the internet lately in the land of social media that we're trying to unpick, and we'd love to get your feedback. We've written an accompanying blog post to this that you can read. I've linked it in the show notes. But do leave a comment on this one because I'm genuinely interested to hear what you think as we try and work out what we think about it. Okay, let's get in. Just a note before we do, I have a new mic, which is why the sound quality is way better, but I didn't fully understand how the cable works. So there's occasional little boings in the middle of the conversation, which is the cable hanging around, and I'm trying not to touch it, but it still boings. And so for that, I apologize. We will work on a less boingy podcast in future.
Okay, here today with Gill. Jill wanted to do a quick podcast because she's got some beef with the internet. Because I don't really spend much time on social media, I thought maybe she could explain it to me and we could talk about her beef. So Jill, what's your beef?
Hello, thanks for having me. Yeah, I do have beef this week. I often have beef with social media. I thought it would be interesting to maybe talk about it because I haven't actually quite worked out how I feel about it. So we could talk about it. Maybe I'll write a blog on it, see what other people think about it.
Yeah, maybe you should have a
If
special
you're
beef blog.
listening, yeah, if you're listening, you can chime in too. Maybe it's annoyed you too. Anyway, this episode of Jill's beef with social media is about lifting. It's about strength training. For a bit of context, if you're on social media, which you may be if you're following us, and you are interested in getting stronger as you get older, you will realize that there are many different voices in this space. And a lot of them, there's kind of two prominent camps. Well, there are a bunch of camps, but we're going to focus on two because they're quite noisy. And there's one camp that are like, right, you really need to be lifting heavy for your bones. And the other camp are saying you need to be lifting medium weight for your bones. And I feel like ultimately I understand where they're coming from because they both follow slightly different research on their recommendations for loading. And I understand, I just don't, I feel like they're fighting in the same place. It's like they're in the weeds and they're just scrapping over the same stuff because ultimately the message to me, I just feel like we're getting a bit lost here in the detail. If you're on social media and you haven't started strength training and you've never done it before, the whole idea of lifting heavy is everything's heavy. Everything's kind of frightening because you've never done it before. You're worried about injury. You're worried that you're going to do it wrong. I don't think that the messaging around heavy or medium is that useful. I understand why people are saying it, and I understand that social media puts these in these little camps, but I just think it's not a very constructive argument, and I think it baffles people. I think if you've never done strength training, you're already so worried. Maybe you're osteopenic or you're just kind of heading into your sort of perimenopausal, menopausal, and there's so much noise on social media about everything. But, so much noise about, we've got to start strength training. I just think this bickering over heavy and medium is not helpful. I think it just makes people confused. And then I think, and this is where we can get into the chat, this is what irritates me the most, is ultimately, why are any of us getting into strength training? Sure, you're doing it for your bone density and quality, but ultimately you're doing it so you can just be really capable, so you can do the stuff that life requires and not have to overthink it. This is about building your capacity as you get older so that if Sue next door, I don't know who Sue is, Sue, your neighbour next door, wants you to move a pot from the front of her house to the back of the house, you can lift that pot and you don't even need to think about it. If there's a sofa that needs lifting, you can go and do that. If your parent has a fall, you can help them up. That's what we're focusing on, actually. So ultimately, it doesn't matter how heavy, you just want to be able to lift. You want to know how amazingly capable you are and not worry about it. Anyway, that's the beginning of my beef.
Yeah. All
Go
right.
for
Well,
it.
let's
What do you
let's
think?
unpack that a little bit. I guess one of the first things we can talk about is this idea of heavy versus medium lifting and what that even means, and also what the research says. So, you know, pretty much there has been a flurry of very good research that's come out on lifting for general population, the importance of progressive strength training, resistance training, and a lot of the good stuff in the last few years has really come out on improving bone mineral density, or what's the kind of threshold for osteogenesis? What's the threshold to get your body to respond by improving bone density and bone quality and things like that. And one of the fairly recent papers, I guess it's a little bit older now, but I would still consider it recent, is the LIFT-MORE trial. The LIFT-MORE trial, it got a lot of attention when it came out because they were working with older populations, and they were getting them to do a lot of those classic strength movements at quite high percentages. We're talking about 85% of one rep max, which is kind of that challenge that, that's kind of like the range that power lifters more or less train at, depending, if they're peaking for an event, then they'll start going up into their 90s, 95%. But that means that's really heavy. That's like 5 reps of seriously heavy work. So, a lot of people are saying, well, we really need to be working around 85%. And that does seem to be what the evidence bears out. And recently there have been some other studies that have come out, 2022, 2023, 2024, saying, well, actually, there's probably some benefits if people lift around 70% of their one rep max as well. Now, that being said, there does seem to be this, maybe dose response isn't the right word, but there does seem to be this general trend. And there's a recent meta-analysis that came out of Japan, Kitagawa et al. And they're saying it's like, yeah, generally heavier lifting is going to be better, at least on paper. And if you can be lifting around that 85% zone, then that's probably going to give you the most benefits in terms of strength and bone mineral density. But, a lot of that is, we talk about this all the time, but this sort of distinction between efficacy and effectiveness. And efficacy is how well does something work in a lab setting, and effectiveness is how well does something work in the real world. So I think that's one of the considerations that we should talk about. So why don't you go ahead and give me your reaction to that, and we can kind of situate the rest of the conversation.
Yeah, I mean, I think it would be maybe we talk a little bit about this idea, and we talked about this earlier about gym logic and when it kind of skews it skews our thinking a little bit. I think the problem with gym logic, and you can go into this much better than I can, Andrew, with your gym background. I think you just get into the detail about loading and percentages quite quickly, and I think you can. I just think we've just got to get back to capabilities. If you're bringing people in strength training, that to me is the central message of
Yeah.
everything.
Well,
It's like, how
I
can
think
you
so.
help people discover how capable they are?
Yeah, it's like you opened with this, and then we talk about all the time. What does a couch weigh? What does a rock weigh? What does a toddler weigh? All these different things. You know, and we sort of live in this world because we live in cities and we live in suburbs and we live in homes. There's a lot of objects around our lives that are roughly the size that they're kind of designed with the assumption that a human being, maybe a man, there might be some bias here, should be able to pick up. So this idea that if a friend needs help moving a couch, that 2 people working together should be able to pick up a couch or a sofa. Or if you're doing some gardening and you load a wheelbarrow up with rocks and gravel, the idea is a wheelbarrow is roughly of the size where you should be able to pick it up by the handles and roll it around. If you go to a hardware store, a DIY store, and you buy some sand, or you buy whatever, some potting soil, they're going to come in bags. And the assumption is that these bags are meant to be lifted, by human beings. And, this range of things, let's say it's somewhere in the range of anywhere from 15 to 40, 45 kilos. So let's say somewhere between like 30 pounds up to about 100 pounds is kind of this is, what we're going to interact with every day. And I think if we're looking at capabilities, sometimes we lose the forest through the trees because people talk, well, you should be able to deadlift a barbell at this weight, and you should be able to whatever, progress by adding 2.5 kgs to the bar every week, or, whatever. But yeah, I don't think we do a very good job, or I would say the industry doesn't do a very good job saying, isn't it great to be able to pick up a big bag of groceries and walk upstairs? Or isn't it great to be able to, let's say your 7 or 8 year old has fallen asleep, to pick them up and, drop them in bed? Or isn't it nice to be able to go to a DIY shop and load up your trolley or your cart with a bunch of bags of potting soil and get them into your car? And I think that is so meaningful. But I think sometimes when all we do is we focus on, these very specific items, these very specific weights, sometimes people, I think, become obsessed with the weights themselves. Now, that's sort of a different discussion from this idea of progression and getting stronger. But I think the industry does a very bad job of showing people that it's meaningful to become more capable and to be able to interact with heavy things around you. So I think that's one point we can talk about.
I I think part of that might be because the way that social media rewards engagement is that you often, if you as your audience gets bigger, you're kind of rewarded for for less nuanced messaging, more extreme messaging. And then I see these bigger platforms. I think I'm sure you can explain this possibly more clearly, but I feel like when you become somebody with quite a loud voice on social media, you sort of end up digging yourself into a place, because it's like, well, this is my message, and I'm just gonna keep saying this message. And why, that message might be great, but I'm thinking about some of the really big accounts that have kind of really dug in and don't and seem to have lost the ability, as they've become bigger and more famous. They seem to have lost the ability of self-reflection, or not of being open-minded to new research as it comes in, and possibly being
Yeah.
open-minded to changing their stance a little bit. I think the one I was thinking about, well, I can think about a bunch, but the one that we've been talking about a lot is Squat University, who have a very big Instagram following. I can't remember. It's like millions, isn't it? I think. And they've got a really big presence on YouTube. And I feel like in the last few years, they've just dug right in to this quite narrow way of looking at how the body works.
Yeah. Yeah, I think we can look at this from a few different angles, but if we start with Squat University, one of the things that's funny about Squat University is if you talk to a lot of people who've been in strength and conditioning for a while, and the account's been around for a while. I mean, I think certainly, I think at least 10, 11, 12 years, some form of social media presence. And if you talk to a lot of people who've been watching, they say, oh, yeah, Squat University, I used to really enjoy some of the stuff that they did. And I thought that they had some interesting ideas. And now, in some ways, I think people kind of roll their eyes at Squat University. And there's a couple factors at play, I guess. First off, there's always this idea of audience capture on social media, or sometimes people talk about flanderization as well, which is the more time you spend on social media, like you said, it kind of rewards you for certain messages, and it tends to always ratchet in one direction, which is either more extreme or more focused. And I wouldn't say that Squat University is extreme, but I would say that what they've done is they found a formula that really, really works. And, one of the things they'll usually joke about when people, sort of roll their eyes at Squat University is all their videos will almost always start off with a quick flash of the back of somebody's backside. Usually it'll be an athletic woman. You'll see her bum or her thighs. And then it'll have the classic Mr. Beast kind of entry. It's like, she thought she would never lift again until this happened, so people kind of click on it. And then it's usually some variation of usually Stuart McGill sort of inspired model of back pain, which, I I still like a lot of some of the more nuanced arguments that Stu McGill makes. I think the thing is that a lot of people are sort of engaging with some of his least nuanced or maybe exaggerations of his statements. But I do think that sometimes people who are proponents of a lot of McGill's models are not as flexible in interpreting different contexts. And for people who don't know who Stuart McGill is, he's a Canadian researcher, and he's probably one of the more influential, I would say, um, mechanistic model back experts out there. And what he really recommends is, especially after people have had an injury, that they focus quite a lot on bracing, and they try to minimize movements outside of a neutral spine, which in some contexts could be the best answer. But then also, certain people will probably benefit from adding in more movement and capacity from different angles in their lower back and not trying to be overly protective. And that's a conversation for another day. Anyway, so I think the issue with Squat University is they've become so narrow in what their message is. They almost have this sort of sunk cost fallacy in that they've spent so much time promoting this very strict message that they can't really back out now, because they've had so many conversations and so many debates with people that this has sort of become their brand. So they're sort of stuck. And in some ways on the internet, it's probably useful being in a very specific corner. So I think that's one example of people who get stuck. I think the other issue sometimes is context collapse, which is, and it ties in with your opening observation, which is sometimes people are arguing over such minute differences that almost shouldn't even matter, other than maybe it doesn't agree with their very specific online branding. But this idea of context collapse is, sometimes someone will make a statement in one sphere of the internet. Maybe they're over in the yoga section, or maybe they're over in the Pilates world, or maybe they're in the powerlifting world, or whatever. And certain something goes viral, it breaks containment, and then all of a sudden it starts showing up in other parts of the internet. And outside that context, people get very angry. And sometimes I see two figures, who I respect and I think probably agree on 99% of things. They are responding to one extreme statement or out of context statement from one person, and then they start arguing, and people focus so much on the small differences that they sort of forget how much they have in common. I think this example of should we be lifting medium heavy or heavy is a good example. It's like, we could be lifting, it's fine to be lifting 70% of your one rep max. And the people are like, no, you have to be lifting 80% of your one rep max. What does that really mean? And is that even a real thing? If people are lifting to a certain amount of effort, and if people are adding progress, and if they're getting stronger over time, are these percentages even real? Because it'll change from implement to implement as well. The example I always use is, back when I was deadlifting more regularly, I confidently could deadlift 200 kilos, 440, 450 pounds, thereabouts. And the first time I ever tried picking up a 150-pound sandbag, I couldn't do it, you know? Um, and in a way, the whole argument of lifting heavy or not heavy completely ignores that we're moving things out in the real world. There is a world of progression outside of micro loading 2.5 kilos on your barbell every few weeks. And I think sometimes people forget about that because they become so obsessed with this assumption that people are lifting things in the gym, which is a very valid way of measuring progress, that they forget that there's this whole outside world and all different ways of training. People got really strong and built really dense bones historically before we had microloading, before we even had modern barbells. So it is something that is possible. And if you would, talk to some sort of strongman or strength athlete from 150, 200 years ago, they wouldn't even know what their percentage of 1 RM was on certain things, because their brains wouldn't even think about it that way. They would just think, well, I lifted up this rock until I got really good at it. And then I found a heavier rock and I lifted that rock until I got really good at it. And now I'm really strong.
Ta-da! I mean, wouldn't it be
Ta-da, and
great
that's it.
if we could get I just think the medium weights lift heavyweight, I feel it just ultimately they're arguing for the same thing, and if we could get everyone lifting at the weight that was even medium, that would be great. What a great thing to have done, and I think it's just yet another sort of, not distraction, what's the word I'm looking for? I think it just puts up
Uh,
another barrier if
yeah,
you're
another barrier.
already you're trying to find your way through all of this noise around strength training, and that's just another thing that's in the way, like, "Oh, so should I do this program because it says heavy, or should I do this program because it says medium?" Ultimately, when you start strength training, you're gonna start really light, and you're gonna start just building your confidence in the movements. So you see these people on social media including me sometimes, because I lift heavy things. And you think, God, that is really heavy. There's no way I could ever lift that heavy. No program is going to put you on those really heavy weights straight away. You're going to spend ages, like could be literally months, building up
Yeah.
your confidence in the movement. And I think there's a something I noticed the other day. So our 6-year old, oh no, he's 7-year old, um, was down at our gym shed the other day, and he push pressed overhead an 8 kg kettlebell. We never exercise explicitly with our children. I don't teach them anything to do with kettlebells unless they ask to do it. I mean, they see us using
Mm.
kettlebells, but I'm not interested in teaching my children to exercise. They move a lot, and that's fine. Anyway, he wanted to push press an 8 kg kettlebell, so he did, and he's just a small, wiry guy. Um, and the weight relative to his weight, I don't even know how much he weighs. I mean, it's quite a chunk of weight for him. But it was interesting
Yeah.
watching him do it, and there was no conversation or noise in his head that stopped him from doing it, that prevented him from trying. And then I look at some of our members, or some of our clients. If you've never done strength training and you're starting in your 40s, 50s, and 60s, we have so many complex barriers in our heads. You sort of almost don't realize before you start um, how loud the noise is. Like this noise about, "Oh, I'm going to injure myself. I don't think I can do this." We could spend 4 to 5 months getting somebody to push press an 8 kg kettlebell over their head, and it wouldn't be because they were necessarily suddenly stronger. It's just that they've learned the movement pattern, they've removed the noise, they suddenly see that it's an option. I think I don't know where I'm going with this. I just feel it was just quite shocking to watch a little tiny 7-year-old just be like, "Oh, is this how you do it?" Like, "Yeah, bend your legs, off you go, push up. Oh, there you go, there you got it."
Mm.
And it just wasn't a thing for him because he didn't have any of that baggage.
Yeah. I think it's a really good point, and we've seen it as well with the tire drags as well. I remember there was we were trying to convince some fully grown adults that they could drag a car tire attached to a bit of webbing. And you saw so much hesitation, sort of because of the stories they were telling themselves, these sort of limiting beliefs. And then in the background, I remember just seeing some kids pulling them and having a great time and laughing their heads off. Yeah, there's sort of two things. I think you're right. I think people sort of place these kind of mental restrictions or almost kind of negative narrative, nocebo restrictions on themselves, where they just don't think things are possible. And you see that all the time with someone who'll be walking, carrying a child that weighs, 7 kilos or 8 kilos or something like that, or carrying a bag that probably weighs, 8 kilos. And then the moment you put in a weightlifting implement in their hands and they associate with working out or exercise like a kettlebell, you see them just sort of crumple. In that, we've had people very comfortably chuck tires or even like soft medicine balls, but because they're less intimidating, suddenly they can do it. So you see there's a big mental component. And then the other thing, which is very similar, but I think subtly different, and there's almost, I don't think I have the language to say this without sounding dismissive, and that's not my goal. But all the mental things aside, if people haven't had the opportunity to lift heavy things, if they've never been in an environment where it's acceptable or they never decided they were going to do it or prioritize it, people are so detrained when they come in sometimes that this whole debate about heavy or not heavy, it almost doesn't even matter for the first 6 months of training because people will make so much progress. You can get someone, let's say we're in a traditional gym situation and they're trying to do a classic bench press, so they're lying on their back. They have they have the rack or the J hooks and they have a bar, which is usually about 20 kilos, and they unhook it. They unrack the bar, and as soon as they're holding it, they just start wobbling and they can't move it at all. And they don't have the stabilizers. They just haven't learned the movement. Strength is a skill. They're not familiar with it, and just trying to bring it down to their chest, they can barely even do it. But with that same person, once they get used to the movement, you could probably put 5 pounds on the bar every single week. And this would be for a lot of women as well. You could probably do that continuously for weeks, if not months. And before you know it, suddenly, they're, quite comfortably pressing like 100 pounds, 115 pounds, something like that. And they don't even have to put on new muscle for that. That was sort of capability that their body already had. They just didn't have, the nervous system coordination. They just didn't have that experience doing it. And then that's when the real strength training begins. And what I mean is that that's when all of a sudden things like percentages and adding weight to the bar matter, because the first few months is just people getting familiar with their own bodies and their own capabilities. They're just not quite in line with actually what their physical capacities would be if they just had an opportunity to practice. So if someone is online and they're not currently lifting and they see this whole debate about 70, 85%, it's not real, Those percentages don't really matter until you actually have a 1RM that's a reflection of some kind of training. Like I don't think there's much merit in starting people, with a 1RM test if they're untrained. The only reason I would see someone doing it is if you were a gym trainer and you wanted to show how good you were as a trainer and say, hey, look, when you first lifted, you could only do this. And now in 6 months, I've made you 3 times stronger. But that's not really because the trainer is an amazing trainer. That's just because someone who goes from completely untrained and not really having the opportunity to use their body to having 6 months to all of a sudden their body starts to kind of calibrate to the world around them, then people make amazing gains. Those newbie gains, they're almost never structural. They're basically just, through neural efficiency. So I think that needs to be emphasized as well, is this 70, 80% is really dependent on people who are already lifting for it to be meaningful.
Yeah, just to clarify, if you don't know what 1 RM is, that's your 1 rep max. That's the heaviest thing you can lift once, and then you need a chunky rest. But I think for me, the message that I keep coming back to, so we have a bunch of courses. Wild Strong is generally, our remit is wide. Our focus is on building capabilities, not just in movement, but also bringing people out and getting them chatting together and having a nice time in a place that feels meaningful to them, with people that they can build meaningful relationships with, and that element of skill building over time. But one of our courses is very laser focused, which is Strong for Life, and that's a very small little bit of our overall offering, but it's actually the fun thing about strength training. So for anyone listening, I'm absolutely rubbish at doing anything consistently. Like Andrew's very good at going and getting his workout in on his own. Well done, Andrew. I have to do it with a group. I just find it, I don't find it meaningful otherwise. So for me, a big part of what's meaningful for working out is the social time and just catching up with people. Yes, obviously, I really enjoy being more capable, but that is more of a kind of back of the head sort of thing. That's not the motivation that gets me out of bed to a 7:30 workout. The thing that gets me out of bed to 7:30 workout is the fact that people will notice if I'm not there and I'll have a nice chat. Um, I don't know where I'm going with this. Oh, yes. Sorry, I should have written this down. But what I with the strength training, I think the thing for me is that it just allows you to suddenly build this baseline set of capabilities that means you can do so many other things. You can do all of the fun stuff. You can do all of the stuff in life without having to think, oh, I really better watch myself. I don't have that voice in my head unless I'm doing something really extreme. I very rarely have a voice in my head that's like, whoa, you better watch yourself. Because I know how capable I am, and I know I can do it. And if I can't do it, then I'll get help to do it. But I know that the task can be solved, and I can either do it on my own or I can do it with someone else. But there is no fear at all in my head. And that all comes from building up that confidence in those sort of strength movements, which allow me to then go and do all the other fun stuff, which I actually really enjoy doing, like the vaulting and throwing and chucking myself off stuff. Um,
Yeah,
I
I think
appreciate that we're coming up to half an hour, so I'll let you do it. We'll start closing it off.
yeah, we'll start closing. I think regarding the Strong for Life, which is our sort of, I would say our application of quantifiable gym logic in what we think is the simplest and I think probably most effective way just to get people to start training. Um, one of the things we've always talked about is we always kind of see that as a bridge course, because I think it is good to spend some time thinking about progressions and tracking things and quantifying things, just so you can get a sense of everything moving in the right direction. But I think once you sort of pass this threshold of capability and confidence and realizing that you can lift certain things, whether squatting, hinging, deadlifting, pressing, whatever, then all of a sudden, once you pass that threshold, you just kind of have a good sense of what a workout is. And what I mean is a lot of my training nowadays, I'll pick up a barbell, fairly regularly because I enjoy it and I kind of see it as meditative. But I'll do a lot of training. I'll just pick up a rock or I'll just pick up a sandbag and I'll just move it around and chuck it and do it in such a way. And, you kind of have a sense of like, is this heavy enough? Am I kind of pushing myself in a way that's going to be meaningful? And then tying it back to what you said is you just know you're going to have that skill transference. I think if people spend too much time focusing on the minutia of, am I getting this up by 1%? Am I increasing this by 2 kilos or whatever? Sometimes you don't get that transference of like, oh yeah, you look at something, I could pick that up. It's just nice to like look at a big rock, be like, yep, I could pick that up, or you see a big log in the woods and you think, oh, I bet I could press that a few times. And that is really fun because it maps over the world in a way that I think a lot of the gym focused discussion really misses out on.
So to tie it up, because we're coming to 30 minutes, I think, well, we were going to go into a bit more of Jill's beef about yoga and Pilates messaging around strength training, but I think we'll leave that to another episode. I think if you're listening and you're thinking about starting strength training in a way that works for you, I think the main message is you can start wherever, you can start wherever you are. You don't have to go to a gym. There will be an entry point that is suitable for you. It just might take a bit of time to find it. And I think we say this a lot, but basically once you're over 40, everyone has a bunch of limitations, whether that's, joint replacements, just stuff not working the way it used to, whether you've, arthritic or you've got osteopenia or osteoporosis. There's always going to be something, and there will be options for you that are available right now. And it might, it's a long journey. You can start now and you will see huge progress in 6 months, but don't get bogged down in all of the social media noise around whether you should be lifting heavy and whether you should be lifting medium. Anything to add to that?
No,
That's it.
well done.
And I cut myself off. All I was going to say at the end of that was thanks very much for listening, and do let us know your comments on this, because it does seem to be a sort of continuing debate in the land of social media, and I'd like to know what you think about it and whether it irritates you as much as it irritates me. Maybe I've missed a point. Anyway, let us know. Put the blog below. We'll be back very soon.